Hello again, everyone. Today I am here to share some brushes that are new to me that I purchased from Joann's in a big sale. So I guess you could call this kind of a brush haul video. Part of the reason why I wanted to show this is because these are all Princeton brand brushes, and they all can kind of do something different. But I was able to get these at a really great deal at Joann's. Joann's is actually a great place to check out for sales for things like this because sometimes they have like super deep discounts, but none of these are super high end in the Princeton line. I would say that, um, so these here are somewhat beginner brushes, so they're less expensive. This one is a specialty brush that I had never seen before. So I'm not quite sure, where that lies as far as, student grade versus professional. And then I would say these are probably the next level up. These are the Velvet Touch. And then sort of the semi higher end brushes from Princeton. This is the Catalyst poly-tip bristle brush, and this is specifically for acrylics. I think you could also use it for oil. I'm going to ignore oils today because I don't work in oils, but you could use this for oils as well. But pretty much for my purposes, this is an acrylic only brush. And then this is a little bit of a higher end brush too, the Umbria, and it's a little stiffer. And I purchased it specifically to work with gouache. So that's why I have a gouache tube here. I did do a prior video where I swatched all of these, the Shinhan Designers Gouache Set B. I swatched all of those with this brush and it worked really, really well. So I definitely think that this is a winner for gouache, but I'll do a little bit of a testing here today as well. So these two, like I said, I got them for a specialty purpose, acrylic only. And then this one I got for gouache. However, it is, let's see, I wrote these down. So this is rated actually for acrylic, oil, or watercolor. So you could also use this for watercolor, but gouache is essentially watercolor. But like I said, my plan is to use this for gouache exclusively. So I'm just going to test it with that. And so this actually is watercolor only, and it's a big wash brush. You could use it for washes or blending. I am not going to be testing this particular one today because I actually got this for a special purpose that you might not necessarily think about for some brushes like this. So I got it because I've been having, whenever I erase things on the page, I usually brush it off like this, right? And then sometimes that can lead to smudging, especially if I'm working in pencil. But this, I'm just going to put a little bit of eraser material down there. You can barely see it. Let me zoom in a little bit. So if you see that there, that's what I got this for. So that and not just this, I also was not just eraser dust, which it seems to be pretty good for. That was kind of the primary thing I was thinking of, but I also thought that I might be able to use it like that for pastels. I haven't tried it yet. I might just give it a go. There probably still would be some smudging with this, and I think it's a little better for, just getting schmutz off your page, which I have been looking for something like this for a little while for that purpose. So I'm not going to be testing this with watercolor, and it's only rated for watercolor according to Princeton. But I'm going to put this aside. So this is going to be the last time you'll see this brush. The rest of the brushes here are all designed for basically whatever you want to use them for. All of these can be used for any kind of media, oil, acrylic, or watercolor. And as I was saying, these blue-handled brushes are kind of like the student grade, and then Snap, I think, is also kind of student grade. But these tend to have a similar feel. So not super, super stiff on the Snap brush, but, stiffer than, say, a softer watercolor brush. Certainly not as soft as something like this. This I still have to get the binder off of that they put on to keep the tip stiff in shipping. But for example, this one is pretty similar to this in feel. One is just white and one is yellow. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot more difference than that. These are all synthetic too, I should mention, including the one that I put off to the side. Those are all synthetic. And so this is a little, what is called a chisel blender. So it's a very short flat brush. And then I have another side, this one I haven't used, so it's also still stiff. And then this one is a little bit softer, but it's in the same line. So again, you could use it for acrylic or watercolor. I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna be using these as I go through them. These I have always used for watercolor only, Velvet Touch, but in looking at how it was rated by the Princeton company, they do say it's good for pretty much all media. I think maybe, so wait, this is the Velvet Touch. Yeah, no, they said you could use it for oil as well. So the vast majority of these are mixed media, so you could use them for whatever you wanted. And basically it comes down to how stiff do you want your brush to be? What type of feel do you like when you're painting? So for example, this has a little bit of a stiffer feel than say something like this, although even though this is in the same line as these others. And then this is stiffer still than those. So, and that's why I specifically wanted to use this for gouache, because I wanted to have a little bit of a stiffer brush. All right, so what I'm going to do, so I'm going to actually, let's see. So the one that I'm going to test with watercolor, I will test, let's see, I might test all of these with watercolor just to kind of give you a quick thing. I have a little pan of watercolor here. I chose a full pan just in case I needed a little extra room, but I don't know. And I think that this one I might not use for watercolor, but I will show you how to use it with acrylic ink. Any of these could be used with acrylic ink, but this is probably more what I will be using this for, is acrylic ink, just because it's a little more conducive to like flowy stuff on the page. So I'm going to put that aside with the ink. That's probably the only one I'm going to use with the ink. And then let's see. So I will use this one with acrylic because that is an acrylic only brush. I will use this one with the gouache. And these, let's kind of play it by ear as we go. I'll start off with watercolor, see how they do with that, and then we can maybe move on to some different media. What I don't recommend is to, as far as your brush collection, I don't recommend mixing medias after you've used it for something. Like have it dedicated for that particular purpose. And that really more applies if you're going to be going from acrylic products to watercolor, because you could potentially spread acrylic into the watercolor, which would mess up the watercolor. The other way around, I don't know that there would be that much of an issue, but it's generally good to dedicate certain brushes for certain purposes so that there's no cross-contamination. Also, cleaning is a little bit easier with watercolor because it is water-soluble continually, even after it dries. The acrylic products will dry on the brushes, and so you want to make sure you clean them accordingly. I do have a little pot of water off to the side here. I'm actually going to do these last. Let's put that watercolor aside. So I am just going to show you the gouache again with this particular brush. Oh, you know, we could have used my little mop brush to get those things off to the side. So let's go ahead and put a little bit of gouache here on the page. And this particular brush, like I said, when I did the swatches, I was really, really impressed with how it handled the gouache. So what I did was I just dampened the brush, wiped it off on the top of my water container, and then just dabbed it on a paper towel so that it wouldn't be too much water in here. So if we grab that, really nice. If we want to add a little bit more water to get it to flow further, really, really works well. And you know, you could do little marks with that. You could get, you know, if you're going to do sort of a dry brushing technique there. So this is really good for this purpose. I'm just trying to get the gouache off the brush. I think, and I'm going to try the watercolor with this one as well. I do think that this is a little stiff for my liking for watercolor. I tend to either like something really soft or something sort of in the middle. Sometimes there's a use for a stiff brush, like if you want to do some detail work. Boy, that particular gouache color is like super pigmented. I'm trying to get that out of my brush here. So basically I've rinsed it out and then put some more water in here. I mean, it's perfectly fine for watercolor, but it's not going to hold as much water for doing larger washes. And that's part of the reason why I want to use it for gouache, because there's not as much water being used there. Okay. And like I said, I've been really, really happy with it for using for gouache. So this is one I would recommend for that, Umbria. All right. So now I'm going to do the acrylic brush, this fan brush. I have, oops, like we have little fibers going on here. Let's make sure we get all those out. So I actually have never used a fan brush with acrylic. So this was something that I wanted to add to my collection. Usually I'm using either flat or round brushes, but let's see. So this is just, oops, that's probably more than I needed. This is Amsterdam acrylic standard series. This is just a very small container of that. So again, I'm just going to lightly dampen this brush, and I probably, so as you can see, when I dampened it, it kind of clumped together. So I'm actually thinking that I want this one to be a little bit drier. So I'm going to, and it seems like you could also kind of, you know, mess with the bristles and do that in a different way, make it look a little different. So if it was completely dry, you'd probably get some finer lines. But let's see. Let's go ahead and put this in here. I'm going to try and get acrylic on everything. Oh yeah, that's kind of cool. Yeah. And even though it's a fan brush, the bristles are stiff enough to deal with the acrylics this way. So it's kind of fun. I mean, this might be good for mark making in particular, or dry brushing. And I think we're kind of running out of acrylic paint there. But yeah, I'm going to have to play with this one to see what I want to do with that. One of the nice things, so I just rinsed this out and it rinsed out super well. That's one of the nice things about these brushes, is that they do rinse out really nicely, even with acrylic in the brush fibers, and they're really durable. So that's probably why these are a little bit more expensive. And I think this might be the long-handled brush, because they have long-handled and short-handled. I generally prefer the short-handled, but you know, when something's on sale, I'm gonna go with that. Okay, so we're putting that one off to the side as well. And then I'm going to use this one with the acrylic ink. So moistening one of these mop brushes is kind of tricky because they hold a lot of water, which is great if you're using it for watercolor and you want it to be very dilute. So what I'm going to do again is just dip it in the water, try and get as much, so I'm just leaving it kind of damp, right? But after that, I am going to, so I wiped it off a little bit on a paper towel so it's not super soaking. It's probably still a little bit more damp than I would like. You could also just work from dry. So let's go ahead. I'm going to shake this acrylic ink up, and let's put some of that here on the page. And what I will do with this, and you know, you can really get some nice blending with this like this. And see how it's kind of consistent and gives you a nice wash there. It would do the same thing with watercolor, but here it's with ink. And like I said, you could use this wet or dry, but that worked very nicely for spreading the ink around. And I'm going to rinse off that brush, which make sure I do it kind of thoroughly because that was acrylic and we don't want the acrylic to get stuck in the fibers of that brush. I'm not going to use this one with watercolor because I don't really have enough space here, but you could do the same thing with that. Okay, so I'm putting that off to the side as well. So now let's move to this sort of assortment here. So we could actually, let me test them all with acrylic and watercolor. Well, actually, let me do acrylic and maybe gouache. Oh, I should have planned this out more beforehand, huh? Okay, so let's go ahead and do this one with the acrylic. This is the Snap Angle Shader. Oh, and if I didn't say, that mop brush was a 1-inch oval mop in the Select, and then the Umbria is a number 6 or 1/2 inch bright. So this one is a 1-inch angle shader. So basically angle brushes are like a flat brush, but with an angle to them, right? So again, I'm going to just lightly dip this in the water, try to get some water out of there because I don't want it to be super soaking. These white brushes will stain, so that's just something to be aware of. I'm going to go ahead and get us a little bit of this acrylic. Man, that just pops right out of there. Get us a little bit of this acrylic. And so you'd probably want to, so you could get a pretty fine line. To me, this brush is not really stiff enough for acrylic, and I probably would more use this for watercolor. So that is kind of, you know, one of the things we're testing out today is what would you want to use it for. But this would probably also be good with the ink because it is a little softer. All right, so I am going to try it with the watercolor. I do actually think that this would not be stiff enough for gouache. So you could get a pretty nice wash on there. You could kind of concentrate it a little bit more, get some nice, you know, that could be grasses or something like that. Obviously it's blue, so grass wouldn't be blue necessarily. And let me just try this really quickly with the ink. This is the one that I was kind of on the fence about because this one seems a little bit softer than some of the others. So yeah, actually I think this would probably be best with acrylic ink, just given how that handled. So that's good for me to know because then I can put that aside in my acrylic ink category. Because I do like to keep my brushes separate for different purposes. Okay, so let me moisten this brush here. Okay, so this is the Princeton Select Angular Shader in 3/8 inch. And this would probably be a good one to use with acrylic. I think also the more floppy the brush, the smaller it is, the better it will stay in its shape. Yes, I think this is a very good one to use for acrylic. And I'm going to try it really quickly with the watercolor. I'm thinking it's probably better for acrylic. I'm just going to dip into this little pan. It keeps drying because I'm in such a dry environment. But yeah, brushes like this are not going to hold very much water. So it's not going to be, it wouldn't be my ideal for watercolor. None of these really that I'm talking about today, other than maybe this one, would be really great for watercolor. I'm also going to use a little bit more of this gouache because I think this would be really good with that as well. Yeah, it works, but I still prefer that other brush here. And this worked really well with the acrylic. So I think I'm going to relegate this one to acrylic. So that's kind of, I mean, it's kind of a feel kind of a thing because these all are mixed media brushes. Kind of decide, you know, for yourself what you like the feel of. And so this is essentially the same brush, but in a 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna, because it's bigger, it's gonna be a little bit more squishy, if you know what I mean. It's not gonna hold its shape as much, but I still think it's great for the acrylic. I'm actually wondering if this would be another one that would be good for acrylic ink, because I already have a couple dedicated to acrylic ink over there. So yeah, I think this is going to be another dedicated to acrylic ink, because that worked really nicely too. And all of these you can kind of use for mark making. You can use different parts of the brush. This is kind of a lighter color, so you can't see it too well. But just based on my quick little test here, this one is going to be an ink brush. So even though these two were kind of the same shape, this one was a little stiffer because it's smaller. This one is a little more floppy, and I liked it much better for the ink. So again, it's just my personal feel for those. All right, and let me go ahead and get this one wet. This is the 1-inch lunar blender is what they're calling it. That one I'm gonna have to soften a little bit better. And this one's pretty stiff. Pretty stiff. Part of that can be binder, but I think a lot of it is just the bristles of the brush. So given that this is so stiff, I think that this would actually be really good for acrylic. So we didn't have a whole lot of that there, and because I had so much water in the brush, I've kind of diluted it. This would also probably be good for the ink. You know, let's try this with the gouache. Might be good for like larger backgrounds maybe. And I'm gonna do a little bit of overlap here because I'm running out of room, but I only have 3 brushes left. So yeah. So again, because I had a bit of water in here, it got kind of diluted, but I think it feels really good with the gouache because it is somewhat stiff. And lunar blender, I think really a blender is like you would blend an edge with something else, you know, doing it like that. I think that, you know, that would be really helpful in the context of acrylic. And there I just mixed the two, which I wouldn't normally do. But this one I think is up in the air. Maybe I would use it for gouache, maybe I would use it for acrylic. So that's still one that I need to decide on. And then let's do the last Princeton Select brush, which is this tiny little chisel blender. This one in particular, I did want to try with the gouache. So let me go ahead and put that on there. Just a little bit. The page is kind of a hot mess, but you know, it's all right. This is all in fun here because this one is very stiff. It's very stiff. So I did get a little bit of water on it. I'm going to dab that off. So, and you know, there is a little bit of drag with that. I'm not really liking that. With more water, it's better, but I'm not really liking that too much with the gouache. I'm wondering if I would like it better with the acrylic. And this is something that I've done with a lot of my brushes that I already have. And it's really a useful exercise because, I mean, you can determine, especially with mixed media brushes, you can kind of determine what you want to use it for. So yeah, see, now that feels a little better to me. That feels a little better to me. And this would be, you know, you can get in there in little details, and you could also do like some mark making with these. This might be nice for like little tick marks or something like that. And it does seem to spread the acrylic better than the gouache, in my opinion. So I think this one is going to be an acrylic brush. Okay, so I'm going to put that in the acrylic pile. And then last but not least, we have these Velvet Touch brushes. So this one in particular, I was thinking of using with gouache because it is such a tiny little thing and I could use it for detail with gouache. But let's see if I like the feel of it, because I may not. In which case I probably would use it for either acrylic or maybe even watercolor. But this is a super tiny one. This is a flat shader in a 0. I'll make sure I don't have too much water on there. Yeah, again, it's kind of, yeah, it's a little too squishy for me for gouache. Because I'm definitely discovering that I like a stiffer brush for that. And what's making me think that is it kind of feathers more at the end. It's not giving me the pressure all the way across, if that makes sense. So that would not be my first preference for gouache. So that's gonna, oh my goodness. I should stop using this really super intense red color because it's gonna stain all the brushes. All right, so I'm gonna add a little bit more water. I'm gonna try it with the watercolor, because that might actually be, yeah, so that's very interesting actually. So it seems to hold quite a bit of water actually. And it's kind of nice for tiny little accents. I think that this is actually going to be more of a watercolor brush for me. And that that isn't all that surprising because I do use the Velvet Touch brushes for watercolor often. So not much of a surprise. I'm going to put that on the watercolor side here. And then this one, I also wanted to try with gouache. This is the Velvet Touch 1/2 inch wash brush. So I'm going to put some water on there, but not too much. And again, we're going to use this really intense gouache. This is already dried over here, so we're going to go over that. And let's see. Yeah, again, it's more of like a feathery texture that I'm not super keen on with the gouache. See how it kind of like feathers at the end, whereas this one, which is the Umbria, I'm going to get it a little bit damp. This one, you know, you're getting more pressure across, so it's spreading it out more. I'm hoping that makes sense to you. I think that's going to be a much more enjoyable experience with the gouache with this stiffer brush here. So let me go ahead and because if I press harder, it just the brush fibers just bend. So that's why that is like that. And let's try this with watercolor. Because like I said, I'm always surprised at how much water these brushes actually hold. Okay. So that might be a good choice, but again, it's just not feeling too good to me with the watercolor. So let me rinse this off again. I'm going to try with acrylic ink. And like I said, I would recommend doing this if you work in multiple medias. You know, do this, check it out, see how you feel. Okay, so it's a little bit better with the acrylic ink. I'm still not too, and we're mixing the two here, which is fine. You can do that. Yeah, again, it's like a little floppy because that's another reason why I'm not so super crazy about the longer flat brushes. Now let's see if this surprises me. I'm gonna go one more time. So this is our last brush, so I'm just gonna try with one more thing. I'm gonna try with the acrylic. And this is the equivalent of like heavy body acrylic here. So yeah, that's very interesting. So this is the most pleasurable experience of all the different media for me, is this acrylic. So, you know, I would not have relegated this to an acrylic brush had I not done this little test here. So I actually have quite a few acrylic brushes, which is good because most of my acrylic brushes tend to be like kind of crappy craft grade brushes. So after all of that, okay, so these all I am dedicating to acrylic paint. I could use them with acrylic ink as well, but that's kind of where I'm going with those. These I'm going to relegate to acrylic ink because that's what I liked the most with those. This one is the lone gouache brush. I may actually try to look for more shapes in this Umbria line because I really do like the amount or the lack of flex with this. It's just a perfect gouache brush, in my opinion. It worked really well for that right away. And then the kind of the surprise of the day for me is that I'm going to be using this Velvet Touch brush flat shader for watercolor. And I'll just use this for, you know, tiny little details. This might actually be fun too for tiny little swatches of color mixing. I don't have two colors here, but if you, you know, if you were mixing two colors and you wanted to do a little, like sort of a gradient, you know, it might be fun for that because you can get quite a bit of water out of that little tiny brush, actually. So it'd be good for that and for details. And I think, you know, if you're going to be doing like coloring in an area with watercolor or something, this would be good for that. Okay. So I think that's all I had for you today. And the main takeaway of this, well, the main takeaway is check out Joann's for art brushes when they have big sales. Highly recommend that. And play around with your brushes with different mediums. If you use different mediums, play around with them. If you work in only one medium, like if you work in only watercolor, you might want to be a little bit more selective with the brushes that you get, because like this was sort of a, I'm just going to get what's on sale kind of a thing. Then I could play around with what medium I like to use best with it. All right, well, this ended up being a fairly long video. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see some of the, I've kind of completely covered up the marks that were made by my fan brush here, which were up here. I'm gonna have to play around with that some more, and I'm wondering if ink might actually be good with that too. As long as it's acrylic, it should be fine. But yeah, this was a really fun experiment, and I'm really glad that I played around with these brushes. All right. Feel free to subscribe to keep track of future videos on my channel. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. I hope to see you next time. But in the meantime, have a great day. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.